Psychedelics is a temporary immersion into very intense states of consciousness where you may touch on some of the same domains of consciousness that some of the great spiritual teachers talk about. They basically open us up and help us remember things that we forgot when we incarnated. They accelerate the purification process that takes place where we slough off all of the limitations that we've accepted as absolutes. I was being plunged systematically, year after year, into the series of visions that humanity was coming to a turning point in its history. We were being taken into a crisis in which there was a birth of a profound shift in the collective psyche of humanity, a shift that would forever change the future of all human beings. It's what I call the birth of the diamond soul. We are entering the dark night of our collective soul, a time of intense purification before spiritual breakthrough, spiritual awakening. If there were one thing that I wish I could take from all the work that I did and reach into my heart and give it to people, it would be to lose their fear of death. If you're afraid of death, you have your entire metaphysical worldview upside down. The imperative seems to be to learn, to grow, to become more than you were before, more compassionate, more understanding, more intelligent, more socially active, to stop harming people with our actions and with our words, with our thoughts, to stop harming people. This is a directive that's built into the very fabric of being. It's the same kind of directive that leads to the birth of galaxies and leads to the birth of stars and solar systems. It's just an imperative that we experience within our human species as an expansion of consciousness, a deepening of consciousness as we go through life.
Hello and welcome to Soul Unique. I'm Anu Peter Brandt. My goal with Soul Unique is to assist you in uncovering, forging, and navigating your own personal spiritual path by sharing the very personal stories of inspiring individuals from all walks of life who are on their own unique spiritual journeys and doing important work in the world within the larger arena of spirituality and personal transformation. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Soul Unique. My guest today is Christopher Bache. Chris is the author of 4 important and compelling books, and one of them, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven, is what led me to discover Chris's groundbreaking work. This book has had a profound impact on me and continues to do so every time I reopen it. I have to say that even if someone has no interest whatsoever in experiencing any kind of psychedelic for themselves, this is an absolutely thrilling and deeply compelling book that touches into profound truths and possibilities about the very nature of the universe and our existence within it, perhaps even the trajectory of life on our beautiful planet Earth, if not the trajectory and intention behind the purpose of the cosmos itself. It's well worth the read, in fact, perhaps multiple reads as I have done myself. Chris is also the author of a book based on his extensive study of reincarnation, and that book is called Life Cycles, Reincarnation, and the Web of Life. And I'm thrilled with anticipation that we will be touching on some of the themes from both of these magnificent books today. Chris is also Professor Emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for 33 years. He also holds appointments at 2 prominent California institutions in the realms of human potential, transformation, and the study of consciousness, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where he is a fellow, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he is an adjunct faculty member. So with no further ado, it is my great honor to welcome Chris Bache to Soul Unique. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Anu. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for being here. It is, again, a great honor to have you with me and with our Soul Unique listeners. I had the privilege of going to a forum retreat with you last year in Berkeley, California, that it was such a joy to be there with you and get an opportunity to ask you questions and be a part of that wonderful group that you assembled there. So, as I think you know, the goal of Soul Unique is to assist listeners on their own spiritual path, whatever that may mean for them, which is, of course, runs the gamut, and wherever they are on that path. So I like to start out with asking my guests about what their early life was like growing up, your childhood. So I'm curious, were you brought up in a religious or perhaps spiritual household? And what was that part of your life like for you?
Well, I grew up in the Deep South, in a small town in Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi. I grew up in a Catholic home, a devout home, but ecumenically oriented, broad horizons. Religion was taken seriously. And I actually studied to be a priest for 4 years. I started in high school. And as early as I can remember, ever since I was about 5 years old, I wanted to be a priest. And it wasn't because of parental urging or anything like that. It was there in place right from the start. So I entered seminary in high school. And then by the time I was a freshman in college at Notre Dame, I decided that celibacy and I weren't really cut out for each other. So I left.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you. And so what did that lead you to? Because clearly spirituality in some form, shape, or form has been a big part of your path in this life.
It has. And I studied theology at Notre Dame. It was my degree in really religious studies. And my first academic love was really the search for the historical Jesus. I mean, that is the historian's analysis of the scriptural documents looked at through an historian's perspective of critical tools in order to deconstruct the New Testament and uncover the kernels of what words actually belong to the Jesus of history and what were overlaid by later editors and theologians. And so I did a lot of work. I studied Greek and Hebrew. That was my first orientation. And I went on to do my master's at Cambridge in the same area, in New Testament criticism. And by the time I finished Notre Dame, I was no longer a Catholic. And by the time I finished Cambridge, I was no longer a Christian. And it's not so much that I rejected those traditions. I just kept growing larger and larger. So I always feel very close and friendly to Christianity, but my worldview has expanded into a global perspective. And I should say that the study of the New Testament, the study of Jesus of history, really was my way out of Christianity, because I found a being of such fundamental universal import that I began to realize that he had not been adequately captured by the theologies of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. And then when I began to study other world religions, and I taught, survey courses in world religions all my life, I began to recognize that there were other great beings of great soul integrity and depth in these other traditions, and I began to recognize these universal themes of spirituality that run throughout the world's religious traditions.
Wow, we could do a whole other podcast on all of that, Chris. And I would certainly love to. And that certainly reflects my path, although I'm not nearly as well studied or researched in that arena. So I would love to hear more about that. And maybe we can talk about that towards the end. I always ask my guests for recommendations for books and references, or perhaps paths of study or research that could be of assistance. And I have done a little bit of reading about sort of the true Jesus, or the true teachings of Jesus. And I'd love to hear more, or if you have any recommendations on where to go to find those kinds of resources.
I must say my scholarship is quite dated at this point. I did this work I graduated from college in 71. So my grasp of the literature is dated. So I'm probably not a good referral at this point.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your bringing that up because I think that will be profound for those on any kind of a spiritual path, really. And with the way Christianity has had such and continues to, in certain ways, a powerful impact on our culture, especially in the States and Europe, etc. I think that would be possibly open up some doors for them of possibilities that they hadn't considered before. How did you end up becoming a professor of philosophy and religious studies? Perhaps we can segue to there.
Well, after I finished my master's work at Cambridge, I came to Brown University, and I made a transition. At that point, I realized that I did not want to be an historian of antiquity. So I basically erased all my graduate education at that point and started over again. I started over in Western religious thought and eventually settled into philosophy of religion. I finished my graduate work as an analytically trained philosopher of religion in a kind of a classic mode. By the time I finished graduate school, I was an atheistically inclined agnostic. That's what all my undergraduate and graduate education led to. And then I got a job teaching in Youngstown State University in Northeast Ohio. And my first year there, I was looking for where to take my research next. And I encountered the work of two people who changed my life. The first was Ian Stevenson and his important work on providing empirical evidence for the existence of reincarnation. His book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, was a life change for me, because reincarnation had never been taken seriously either in the religious traditions I had studied up to that time. I hadn't gone into Eastern thought yet, nor in the scientific traditions that had displaced the religions in my thinking. But more importantly was Stanislav Grof. In his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, which had just been published, this was in 1978, a long time ago now, he outlined the results of 20 years of working with psychedelics therapeutically. He laid out the nugget of the method, which was followed quickly in 1980 by his book, LSD Psychotherapy. And as soon as I saw his work, I was very impressed with it, and I trusted his scholarship, I trusted his intellect, and I saw the relevance of his work not just to clinical psychology and healing, which is Stan's work, but to my discipline, which is philosophy of religion. So I knew that I wanted to get involved in this. It was like hearing a soul's call. And so I began my own psychedelic work. In the beginning, I had been meditating, through college at that time, and had encountered the usual blocks that people encounter in the early years of their meditation practice. And at first I thought by doing some of this LSD psychotherapy, I could break through those blocks and achieve realization faster. Well, it didn't quite work that way. Stan outlines two protocols in his work, a low-dose approach to working with psychedelics therapeutically and a high-dose approach. The high-dose approach was really developed in Spring Grove Hospital, where they were working with terminally ill cancer patients in order to relieve death anxiety, basically to try to trigger something like a near-death episode with them, to give them a glimpse of where they were going. And it was very effective. And so I thought, well, if you could do that work, and they were limited to 3 sessions. And I thought if you could do that work safely 3 times, you could do it more than 3 times. And so after 3 introductory sessions, I chose to work with the psychedelic protocol, a high-dose protocol, partly because I was married at the time and it was difficult to find time to spend an entire weekend doing this type of work, and I thought it would just be more efficient. I thought I could get through my personal karma, so to speak, biting it up into bigger bites and processing it and moving it through. But I learned down the road that I was making all sorts of false assumptions. I had assumed that working in these states of consciousness was about personal healing or personal enlightenment. I had a personal model of the psyche that I had brought to this work. But after 2 years, I was going into experiences that were so profound, cleansing, purifying experiences that were fundamentally collective in nature, having to do with the collective psyche, that eventually I had to let go of that model of personal transformation, and I began to entertain what was to me a radical hypothesis that in this work, if you work with highly aroused states of consciousness, the subject, the patient, actually can shift from the personal side of things to the transpersonal side of things. The patient actually becomes some aspect of the collective psyche itself. So basically, I began this work. I tried to work systematically. I brought all my historian's training and philosophical training to a rigorous protocol. I kept detailed records of every session. I wrote them up within 24 hours. And it ended up lasting 20 years. I worked for 4 years, and then I stopped for 6 years, and then I continued for a very intense 10 years. I did, on average, about 5 sessions a year, which some would say that's not much, but if you're working with high doses in a very contained environment, and I was always lying down, headphones, eye shades, shut off from the world, attended by a sitter who was managing the music, and my sitter was my wife, Carol, who was a clinical psychologist. So I had clinical support, I had a lot of logistic support, and I just dove into the work, and it didn't finish. I started when I was 30 years old, and I finished this work when I was 50 years old. And then I took another 20 years to digest that work and wrote LSD in the Mind of the Universe.
Wow, thank you for sharing all of that, Chris. It's just so incredible to me. Your journey is so powerful. And of course, I love how you state that when you started, you had no idea this was going to last 20 years. I think it was 73 sessions over the 20 years.
Yep, 73.
And yeah, I also found it fascinating that you had to do all of this in secret all of this time. And in your regular life, you're a very well thought of award-winning professor and author, and never being able to share any of this work with anybody except perhaps your wife and I don't know, maybe a couple other people in your inner circle. But how did that play out for you?
This was 1978, and the United States had made psychedelics illegal in 1969, 1970. We knew that the door had closed when Harvard fired essentially Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner. So I knew that there wasn't an avenue for doing this work legally and wouldn't be legal for the indefinite future. So I had no choice. If I wanted to do this work, I had to go underground. I don't like breaking the law. This is the only area of my life where I've broken the law, but I just went underground. And in the early years, it was just the price you paid to do this work. But I found in the later years, I found it becoming the secrecy increasingly burdensome. Because when you divide yourself and you're allowed to say certain things to some people and other things to other people, you create divisions in your psyche, which they start on the surface, but the longer you go, the longer those divisions begin to seep into your psyche. And it was the secrecy that allowed me to do this work also became a burden in my own psychological health. So it was I just accepted the risk. I accepted the challenge of doing it this way. And I was glad eventually when I was able to come out of the psychedelic closet, because the psychedelic closet can be just as injurious to your soul as any other closet where we hide our being from the world.
I think in your book, The Living Classroom, you talk about perhaps, or maybe you don't talk about this, but I recall you mentioning it somewhere, how even though you could never speak about it in class, your experiences that were completely changing you, perhaps from the inside out in your psychedelic journeys, were influencing like how you taught your classes and what you brought into that environment with you. Can you touch on that a little bit?
I wrote The Living Classroom in 2008. So I was past my psychedelic work, and I was in my second Saturn return. I was writing a book in which I was summarizing everything that my students had taught me about teaching in the classroom. And I was exploring fields of consciousness in the room, and I was also exploring energetic resonance between myself and my students. And basically, in a nutshell, I found that even though my students did not know about my personal psychedelic work, they began to be impacted by my psychedelic work. When I would go into new layers of breakthrough, they began to experience breakthroughs in their own life. When I was going through very intense purification exercises, they found themselves being drawn sometimes into, not all, but some students were being drawn into intense reevaluations and questioning of their own life. But I began to experience a certain porosity between their mind and my mind. And I would be reaching for an example just to make a point that I was talking about in a lecture. And I would make up an example. I'd just pull something out of my imagination. And my students started to come up to me and say, it's interesting that you use that example today, because that's exactly what happened to me this week. And so I was picking up on their mind, and I was picking up on sometimes pains that they were holding and had been holding for years, sometimes ideas that they needed for them to make the next transition in their life. And this became such a characteristic feature of my classroom that I really had to study it. I had to understand what was happening. And eventually I developed a whole new way of teaching, which, our classic educational models are what you might call Newtonian atomistic pedagogy, because it emphasizes the truth that our minds are separate from one another. We know that. But I developed a quantum pedagogy which also affirmed a second truth, that our minds are interconnected underneath the surface. And so the living classroom lays out this pedagogy, lays out the stories, gives the scientific research, and gives the personal anecdotes that lay this out. Now, this book came out in a new edition in 2004, just came out. And this time, SUNY Press invited me to tell the truth about my psychedelic practice, because I was out of the closet by this time. LSD and the Mind of the Universe was out in the world. So now I was able to say, I didn't talk about psychedelics at all in the first edition of The Living Classroom, but a lot had changed since 2008. So 16 years later, in 2024, I was able to say that the spiritual practice which had generated these phenomena in my experience was my psychedelic experience, my psychedelic research.
I'm just curious, did you ever have any students that then read that new issue of The Living Classroom and perhaps contacted you and said, so that's what was going on all that time?
A few of them have, yes.
Yeah.
Well, a few of them got in touch with me after they read LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And there's a chapter there which I lay it in a compressed form. There's a piece of a chapter where I explain what was going on.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Chris. So I could open up nearly any page in this incredible book, and I'm just going to show it here, and you'll see that it's all dog-eared and marked up, and I love this book so much. So I could open up nearly any page and come up with a number of intriguing questions, but that would take months, if not years. So I'd like to focus on the trajectory of the soul, if you will, the purpose and existence of humanity's ongoing evolution, which you really get into the book in such a beautiful and profound way. And it's always so moving, and it brings me right back to, I think, what my purpose on the planet in this life is right now.
Yeah.
And you talk about a new awareness in human consciousness that is coming forth. And if you will oblige me here for a moment, as I read from your book this powerful statement, and I'm paraphrasing here, that after millions of years of struggle and ascent, we are poised on the brink of a sunrise that will forever change the conditions of life on this planet. All current structures will quickly become irrelevant. All truths will be rendered passé. A new epoch is dawning. There is guiding intelligence within it that knows the future, our bright future, and is preparing us for it systematically. And I just get chills reading this. So you also write extensively about human suffering and how, perhaps incredibly for some people, how suffering in all of its iterations throughout human history, it has great purpose. You say the suffering inherent in evolution is noble beyond words, and that human suffering is part of a cosmic plan that was entered into by all participants. And if you'd be willing to expand on that somewhat, I would love to hear your perspective on that now.
That's jumping into the deep end of the pool, but let's go. Much of the work which is being done with psychedelics now is focused on healing the wounds of the personal psyche, which is an important project, a very important project, documenting that healing. And it's really important for your viewers to understand that my work was not about that. I was a philosopher of religion. I wanted to explore the deep structure of reality. So when you explode your consciousness and when you unearth the pains of your personal psyche and you address them and heal them and you move into deep transpersonal states, what I found was that you don't simply move into unitive, non-dual consciousness or cosmic consciousness. You move into the collective psyche. You move into the psyche of your species, what Jung called the collective unconscious. And in my experience, there the work of healing and cleansing continued for 2 very intense years, working within the collective psyche, seemingly healing or working on healing the wounds of all the damaging wars that humanity has been through and all the tragedies and sufferings that we've been through. So it catapulted me out into the collective dimension of the psyche, and then eventually it catapulted me into the archetypal dimension and into what Stan calls causal reality, and then finishing with 5 years spent in diamond luminosity. So the whole landscape was profoundly beyond healing. It was profoundly beyond personal. It was personal, but it was beyond personal. And so I opened up into those large tracks, and I opened up into large tracks of time. Early on, I transcended linear time and began to move into larger segments of time that I called deep time. And when I went into deep time, eventually I went into deep time first as an individual, but later I went into deep time as the species. I began to experience the species evolution through history and across vast temporal segments. And the chapter that you were quoting from first is from this chapter on the birth of the future human, which I think is probably the most important chapter in the book because it concerns our children, our grandchildren, all of our great children, grandchildren over time. It concerns the human project. And it was one of the complete surprises to me that I was being plunged systematically, year after year, into this series of visions that I was given about humanity, where we are in our current evolution, where we are going, and how this is all being laid out. For 4 years, starting in 1991, so it's a long time ago, this series of visions that humanity was coming to a turning point in its history, a point that it had been preparing itself for systematically for hundreds of thousands of years. But we were coming to this crescendo of history. We were being taken into a crisis in which there was a birth taking place that was a birth not of individual enlightened beings in a sense, but it was a birth of a profound shift in the collective psyche of humanity, a shift that would forever change the future of all human beings who are born after this shift. And I don't think of this shift as something that would take place in a couple of years or a couple of decades. I think it's a multi-generational challenge. We were entering this magnificent period, challenging, but a magnificent period with all these spiritual opportunities coming to us, a shift in the energetic base of the human psyche. But I had not seen how in the world nature was going to pull this off, because when I looked around, I saw people walking around in mall consciousness and sports stadium consciousness. I didn't see a whole lot of, serious, large-scale spiritual work being done. I was missing a lot of it, I'm sure. And then in 1995, I had the experience, a rather radical experience. After a tremendous strip down, I dissolved individually, I dissolved into the collective psyche, and then I entered into deep time, and I was given a visionary experience of what I think is in the process of unfolding for humanity. And that is, I entered a time when I saw that everything was beginning to unravel. All the assumptions of life were beginning to be undermined. We were basically going through a falling apart process. What we could do for a living, where we could live for a living. Fundamental institutions of our civilizations were breaking down. And it appeared to be, and I wasn't given a lot of detail here, but it appeared to be some type of global crisis that was being driven by a cascading series of ecological crises that just kept hammering us and taking us deeper and deeper into crisis. And then when it looked like we were going to go extinct, when it looked like it just couldn't get any worse than this, the worst of the storm passed, and we began to pick ourselves up. And when we did, we discovered that this crisis had opened us so deeply, it had broken down the barriers of our human heart so deeply and so intensely, that when we emerged, we found that we had been changed by the historical global crisis. We began to find the new bubbling up inside of us, new values, new insights, new understandings. And this began to synergistically feed on other people's insights and understanding. It wasn't just individuals having this awakening, but it was so deep, this crisis was so deep that it triggered a response in all humanity. And I think we will get into it later if you want, but I think this has to do with some of the fundamental physics, you might say, of the collective psyche. What happens when the collective psyche is shifted into nonlinear conditions, states of high arousal, which our global suffering took us into. It took me about a year to recover from just that one last vision, because the ordeal of witnessing so much pain and suffering, of experiencing the pain that the human family would be going through in the years and decades ahead, it was devastating. It was really hard. And I walked around my hometown feeling like I was walking around Hiroshima the week before the bomb was dropped, knowing that everyone here is a hero. Everyone on the planet knew what they were getting into. They were heroes for being here. And at some deep level, they did understand what was happening and what they were here for, though on the surface they may not have understood. There are many important insights that emerged from the work, but this particular story of humanity is one of the most important, I think. And it really, if I can extend on this just a little bit more, reincarnation had been part of my thinking for decades by this time. I mean, I wrote Life Cycles in 1990, I think, finished it in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me,
Just
reincarnation, it's just a fact of life. Yeah. That we're all reincarnating. All of us have been reincarnating. And I began to have experiences of the planet pulsing with the reincarnation of generations. I began to experience collective reincarnation. And I began to understand it's not just an individual journey that reincarnation is about. It's also a collective journey, so that all of us are cells within the evolving consciousness of humanity. And I was given other experiences along the way where I had the experience at one point of all of my former lives coming into me. I had done years of past life therapy. I was familiar with a bunch of them, but I experienced all of my former lives coming into me, and they reached a critical point and they fused. And when they fused, there was an explosion of energy that catapulted me into a deep transpersonal state of consciousness in which I was an individual, but an individual beyond any parameters that I had ever reached before. And what the teaching that I was given is that this is the culmination, or this is the next stage of our long reincarnational journey. It's like gestation is long, labor is short, dangerous, and very intense. We've been gestating our next evolutionary form for thousands and thousands of years. We've been incarnating, going back into spirit, coming in, going out, coming in, coming out. But sooner or later, there comes a point, and I think we are coming into that point, where our entire history, all those lives begin to come into us. They become integrated into us. And when they first do, there's a lot of unfinished business, a lot of wounds that have to be healed, and we spend time healing them. But as that continues, they begin to merge more deeply, and this merger of all of our former lives, when it hits that critical point, it's what I call the birth of the diamond soul, because the light that exploded from my heart was a diamond light. And I think this is basically the form that this new human is taking. I think we're in this vast, collective, geopolitical purification process. We are entering the dark night of our collective soul, a time of intense purification before spiritual breakthrough, spiritual awakening. And this is collective. This is the traumas of history manifesting inside the consciousness of our lives. And eventually, when we work through that, when we integrate all of that, and when we make choices that lead to a different future, we will experience this uplifting effect coming up from within us. It's not being imposed from on top of us, but it's an arousal that's coming up from within us, where we begin to live and think like a soul. We begin to recognize that what we are is embodied souls, and our consciousness really is soul consciousness, not personality consciousness, egoic consciousness. And I think that this shift taking place over generations is a shift of the birth of the diamond soul in history. And as this birth takes hold, we will chart a course for humanity unlike anything that's ever been charted before.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Soul Unique podcast. I just want to take a quick pause here to be sure you know that, as is the case with every episode of Soul Unique, if anything is mentioned during the episode that you'd like to know more about, just go to soulunique.com for more information on the topics that are discussed. And while you're there, please sign up for my mailing list. And wherever you are right now, I'd like to just ask you a quick favor. Please find the subscribe, like, follow button and click it to subscribe. It's not a lifelong commitment, but it will help me and all of my guests, because it gives the signal, wherever you're listening, that this is good content. And my commitment to you is that I will continue to bring you content that will assist and inspire you on your unfolding spiritual journey, whatever that may be for you. So yeah, I think so many people that are doing psychedelics right now are doing it with the intention of, personal healing. And very few people are able to take it to this level of transpersonal healing or transpersonal consciousness or collective consciousness. But it sounds like you're really pointing to the fact that that is where we're going, and that those who perhaps are lingering at the end of the line, who haven't, they're in stadium consciousness or mall consciousness, are sooner or later going to be compelled to join this journey in a more conscious, intentional way. Is that what you're saying or seeing perhaps for the near future?
I think we are all hardwired into the collective psyche. We are all, we don't exist separate from the species mind. We are aspects, fractal manifestations within the species mind. So whether we are undergoing a serious spiritual practice, or whether we're doing a spiritual practice ostensibly for our own personal healing, the healing that we realize and the insights that we internalize, they radiate around us 360 degrees. Just like for my practice, I touch my students, all of us are always interconnected with these larger patterns. We distill these patterns within our life, and then we feed back into new patterns around us. So I think that, we are all part of this. That was the fundamental theme of my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, was the inseparability between the individual journey and the species journey, that we're all in this together, we all move hand in hand. It's not about individual realization, spiritual awakening. It's about our collective awakening. It's about a collective transformation. I don't think we can afford to run the planet as a bunch of egos, even well-intentioned egos. It's time for us to grow up. And for us, growing up, I think, means accepting, embracing, and owning the deep structure of our own life, owning the soul, accepting the soul as our primary identity. And this isn't an intellectual thing. I mean, that's fine. Intellect is fine. But this is fundamentally allowing yourself to sink deeply enough into that center of one's awareness where one recognizes that your mind, your qualities of your person, the qualities of your body predate your body, and they reach way back in history, and they will continue to evolve into the indefinite future, into the future. It's just understanding the larger landscape that we're actually enacting our life drama on.
That idea of this larger landscape points me to an even perhaps broader question, or encompassing a broader perspective, like sort of this idea or this concept that there is sort of a directive that we all have, even if we don't know it, that is perhaps born in the intelligence of the universe as it moves through the vast cosmos. And perhaps we are part of universal or the multiverse's intention to bring this broader awareness, this soul consciousness, as you called it, into physical form. Everywhere physical or some iteration of physical form manifests in the universe. I'm curious if you, in your explorations, in your journeys, if you had any sense of, well, is this sort of just what happens in our universe or in the multiverse, that this is the goal of universal intelligence? If there could be a goal that is identified, that we go out with an intention to experience some new part of the universe, some new planet, some new form of physicality, and a mix of physicality and divine intelligence coming into physical bodies. Is that something that happens elsewhere?
I can't answer that question because metaverse, that kind of lies outside my purview, and what's going on in other portions of our galaxy or in other galaxies, that also kind of lies outside my purview. But I think we can, without knowing that ultimate parameters of the thing, we can have deep understanding and deep experience of what's happening in this species on this planet. That is within our range of experience. Basically, all the teachings of all the spiritual traditions, the mystical branches, all agree that our essential nature is the nature of the divine. Our essential nature is our Buddha nature, our Christ consciousness. The soul is a structure that kind of is the more fundamental structure surrounding that divine essence than our individual ego is. But the essence of everything, from molecules to ants to porcupines to human beings, is this divine essence out of which the entire universe springs. Given that, we can't die, but the imperative seems to be to grow, to learn, to acquire, to expand our capacities. The capacities that we are expanding, we didn't design them, we didn't make them, we were birthed into them. People talk about the chakras in Hindu system, from the lowest survival chakra to the highest chakra of unity consciousness. We are activating these capacities that are latent within the human form. Lifetime by lifetime by lifetime, we're growing, becoming more, learning more, making mistakes, but basically moving forward. And so the imperative seems to be to learn, to grow, to become more than you were before, more compassionate, more understanding, more intelligent, more socially active. This isn't simply, as I understand it, This is a directive that's built into the very fabric of being. It's the same kind of directive that leads to the birth of galaxies and leads to the birth of stars and solar systems. It's just an imperative that we experience within our human species as an expansion of consciousness, a deepening of consciousness as we go through life. And whatever we're going through right now over the next 100 years, it's just a phase. It's just the phase that we're coming into. It's going to be difficult. It's challenging. I think we will make it through it. My experience, my visionary experience is that we do make it through it, but evolution will continue. Whatever we achieve, whatever we become, Christ consciousness becomes universal, or the Buddha's awakened consciousness becomes universal among humanity, that just becomes the new platform that evolution will push off of and continue to develop. So 100,000 years from now, if we were having this conversation again, we would be talking about the yet next or other next kind of developmental stage. So one of the things that I think is one of the great takeaways from any deep spiritual practice, including a psychedelic practice, is when one encounters the intelligence that's inside life and the intelligence that lies behind life, and actually experiences this genius intelligence that saturates all of history, all the world, all the biology, all the planets, all the geology, everything that's manifesting around us is manifesting as an unfolding of this self-emergent intelligence, this self-emergent power. We are part of that, but we're doing the same thing that trees have done, that plate tectonics have done, that planets have done. We're just experiencing it as our species does it. And that is when you experience that intelligence, and when you experience the compassion in that intelligence, that it's motivated by love, it's motivated by a desire to share existence and to help other people develop higher capacities to participate consciously in existence. When you experience that, it opens your heart and mind to a collaboration with the fundamental principles and powers driving creation. And it changes the dynamic, because our worldview, the scientific worldview, has been, it's all an accident, it's all a machine driven by random chance. Our lives have no existential merit to them. As soon as we die, as soon as our brain dies, we cease to exist. And that's a terrible, destructive way of thinking. I understand where it came from, but I think we're shifting out of that. We're beginning to understand, no, it's not an accident. There is an intelligence that's been manifesting itself. We don't want to call it God, because God carries a lot of medieval connotations and carryovers that we don't want to affirm, but it is something, it's a universal intelligence. That's why I called the book LSD and the Mind of the Universe, that the universe is as vast as we know it is, but that universe has a mind, it has a consciousness, and this consciousness is as large as the universe is. And when you experience that consciousness, you basically fall in love with life all over again and again, at deeper and deeper levels.
I love that, Chris. And once again, we're definitely connected in collective mind, because I was going to ask you what your concept of God is at this point in your journey, and you already touched on that. So thank you. Yeah, I don't even like to use the term God anymore, just because everybody has their own interpretation of that, and it's often based in perhaps religious principles that are not necessarily beneficial for everybody. So thank you for touching on that. And your journeys with psychedelics, which I love how you talked about it, move beyond personal healing into this more collective form, collective consciousness, perhaps humanity's healing, humanity's evolution. But keeping in mind, at least for me, the listeners of Soul Unique are perhaps on their own trajectory of their own awakening or their healing. And I'm curious if you believe that the awakening that can be facilitated through psychedelic experiences, is that akin to the awakening that is perhaps taught by such luminaries as Ramana Maharshi, Yogananda, Eckhart Tolle, Gangaji. There are so many, beautiful luminaries and teachers. Is that a similar path, would you say?
Well, my answer is yes and no. And both of those are important. I've taught courses in world religions and advanced courses in Buddhism, and I've taught courses in mysticism and meditation. And the great spiritual beings, the great spiritual teachers and masters have always been my guiding light. I've always tried to conduct myself in a way which did honor to their pioneering work in opening up the dimensions of consciousness that they open. Psychedelics are part of this, and of course many cultures, indigenous cultures, have been working with psychedelics for thousands of years, and all of them agree that these are what we would call the body of God. They basically open us up and help us remember things that we forgot when we incarnated. They open us up to a deeper communion. They accelerate the purification process that takes place where we slough off all of the limitations that we've accepted as absolutes when we incarnate as a human being. When I lay out the methodology chapter in LSD and the Mind of the Universe, the name of that chapter is The Path of Temporary Immersion. And I emphasize repeatedly, this is not like the path of meditation where the path of meditation is a slower path, but it leads to a more abiding opening. Ideally, one enters into states that one can slowly learn how to live within and abide permanently within. Psychedelics is kind of a temporary immersion into very intense states of consciousness where you may touch on some of the same domains of consciousness that some of the great spiritual teachers talk about, but your stay there is temporary. Eventually you contract back to your ordinary consciousness, and if you keep doing this, it will change you. Slowly it will change you, never as fast as I had hoped it would in the beginning, because it's a back and forth. You're going back up and then you come back and you have to internalize and stabilize and go back into it. So it opens you to these territories, but it opens you in a way where it doesn't have the same lasting effects as if you were practicing just a meditation path with a teacher. But I think it is moving us in the same direction. A couple of things. I really want to emphasize what I do and say in the book. I do not encourage people to do what I did, to work so consistently at such high doses. I wouldn't do it that way again if I were starting from scratch. I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms every session. I wouldn't do it that way. I would balance high sessions with low-dose sessions. I'd balance LSD with psilocybin sessions or ayahuasca sessions and whatnot. I'd be gentler on myself. I'd take a slower path than I did. At the end of my journey, Spirit said to me, there's a path of the dying of seeing and the dying of keeping. The dying of seeing is the type of death and rebirth that you go through if you work systematically and courageously with psychedelics. You go through a series of multiple forms of death and rebirth. The dying of keeping is a different process. It's how much of that can you retain? How much of that can you hold on to? How much of that can you take and internalize and bring into your daily life? That is equally as important for your spiritual development as the dying of seeing, where you have access to these states. So you create access to these levels of consciousness, but then you have to internalize the values which you experience there and the insights that you internalize there. I emphasize that if you're going to work with any type of temporary state of consciousness like psychedelics, it's very important to have a daily spiritual practice, whether it's meditation, yoga, tai chi, something where you're grounding every day, because it helps you not only in your sessions, but it helps you manage the impact of your sessions on your life, and it gives you a vehicle for you to ground your temporary insights into a lifestyle of transformation. So on the one hand, it touches those things with the teachers, but let me introduce one other variable. It wasn't as clear to me when I was doing it, but it became clearer to me as I process people's experiences when they were reading LSD and the Mind of the Universe, so that now I differentiate 3 overlapping reasons for doing psychedelic work, or ways in which people can do psychedelic work. The first is for personal healing. The second is for spiritual awakening, to sort of realize who you are, what you are, to understand some of the profound spiritual truths of life. The essence of the individual is the essence of the totality. To understand shunyata, emptiness of self, that there really is no separate self. There is no permanently abiding static self. It's all interconnected. We're all involved in each other's lives all the time. If I had been continue to aim at spiritual awakening, I would have worked with psychedelics completely differently. I would have worked with low doses and integrated completely into meditation practice. Perhaps because the doses I was working with were so high, a third protocol, a third trajectory emerged in my work, and that is cosmological exploration. And cosmological exploration is different than spiritual awakening. And I think the spiritual teachers are basically talking and teaching spiritual awakening, to awaken to the divine within, to awaken to the truth of our nature. Cosmological exploration is something different. It's kind of the philosopher's quest. I wanted to understand how reality functioned. I wanted to understand, why is there so much suffering in the world? I wanted to understand, how could an intelligence, if an intelligence lies behind physical reality, how come this was such, and it was a compassionate intelligence, how come it was so hard here? Why is it so challenging? That journey took me not only into the collective psyche of humanity, but it took me into archetypal reality far beyond the psyche of humanity. It took me into some experiences going all the way back to the very birth of creation itself, the first Big Bang out of the primal void. I don't think you have to go into those extreme experiences in order to awaken spiritually to the truth of your own existence and to the truth of life. You don't have to. It's a different agenda. To understand the structure of the Bardo, to understand what's lying outside of the Bardo, the domain where you go in between your physical incarnations, to understand the intelligence that's driving evolution through all the phases of its various stages, all of its phases. I don't think you have to go in depth in those experiences in order to awaken to the core truths and to purify your life so that you get to reside in the transparency that allows you to live and breathe in the great truths of spiritual practice, of your spiritual condition. It's a different undertaking. So on the one hand, I want to say that the yes is that there is an overlap, but it's temporary. The no is that because of the high doses I was working with, and because I was young and stupid and I wanted to understand some of these deep things, it kept taking me into cosmological exploration. And it would ask me sometimes, are you sure you want to take this next step? Because once you take this next step, several of them, there's no going back. You have to, learn to live with what you've encountered. And I would always answer yes. And it would take me through another death and rebirth process and enter me into that territory. So yes and no.
Wow. Thank you. Again, so many questions, but you're mentioning that there's the sense of some sort of guidance that's asking you, you really want to do this? You want to take this step? Do you have any sense of what that intelligence was? Is it a guide or a higher self, or?
Some people do experience their spiritual guides in some sessions, and some people do experience a kind of a higher self. My experience has been different. And again, it would take a longer discussion to understand or speculate why. I experience always being led and guided in my sessions. I experience that even though an individual session may be completely chaotic and wouldn't make any sense to me at the time, over a long period of time, when I put all my sessions back to back, I began to understand the themes that were developing. But this intelligence would take me into a new area, and it would take me back into it in the same session and in later sessions until I had absorbed the insights that it wanted me to absorb. Once it was sure that I had it, then it would take me into another set of experiences, another set of insights. So I always experienced myself in communion with an intelligence and a consciousness, but it never took any form. It never adopted any archetypal form. It never took on any of the robes of any of the, classic kind of spiritual personages. It was always there, and it was always infinitely larger than I was. And I'm sure that it didn't have to be the entire intelligence of the universe to more than swamp my small mind. It was just large enough and deep enough that I gave myself over to it completely. But it never took a specific form. Now, some people do have experiences of specific forms, and I think, again, it was probably the power of the protocol that I used that was grinding me up so fine, just grinding me and grinding me and grinding me. And I think in order to experience a self in your sessions, to experience deities or to experience some spiritual beings, or for the infinite intelligence to wear a face, to experience a self, you have to be a self. But if your protocol completely destructures yourself and grinds you into fine powder and throws you out, then you don't experience a self on the other side of that communion. You are born into vast landscapes, of vast horizons of consciousness, and you kind of live and breathe at those vast horizons. So there's a sense of communion, but not a communion with some type of personified form. Eventually, I called, everybody has to have language for how they language the Absolute, and I call the Absolute my beloved, because it awakens such profound love inside of me. And going in and out of these states, you go into the state is a passionate, deep merger, and then you come out of it as your silly, stupid self, hopefully a little better, but you're still small. Go back and forth. The language of romance seemed to be appropriate, even though the romance is between yourself and your own essential nature. It's between you and you.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with ayahuasca, and there is always the sense that there is this guiding force that is very fierce. And at least in that practice, the people that I work with, call her, Mother Ayahuasca. And it's not a personal, well, she does have sort of a direct line into our own personal experience and what we need. It's not personal beyond that. And it definitely feels larger than us. And like she has this very motherly quality, but again, very fierce, and knowing sort of a higher trajectory of what perhaps our path is and our true intentions for being in this body, in this life are.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to back up a little bit and ask, so you talk about people who are perhaps using psychedelics for their own growth, their own personal healing, and then perhaps taking it into more of a spiritually focused awakening journey and tempering that with meditation. Is there a style or a type of meditation or a frequency or a cadence of meditation that you would recommend?
I don't want to recommend a particular form of meditation. I've practiced several different forms of meditation over the course of my life. I started with transcendental meditation, and then I moved into Vipassana meditation, and then later into Zen practice, and then much later on my psychedelic journey, I took up Vajrayana practice. So I don't think and if you don't touch any of the so-called Eastern meditation traditions, there are many indigenous customs and indigenous traditions, Celtic spirituality, Native American versions of spirituality. Uh, I don't think there's one which is the universal form that everyone should adopt. I think each of us has karmic ties out of our reincarnational history. We have ties to specific lineages, or even ties to no lineage. We're at a stage in our soul's growth where we're leaving behind all lineages together. So I think it's more of a matter of finding a spiritual tradition which speaks to you, a teacher who speaks to you, who awakens the deepest aspirations of your heart and gives you the means of beginning to actualize and realize those aspirations. And that can be done with any number of different meditation or yogic traditions, or some people do it through writing, through literature, through entering into highly creative states, or artist in deep creativity. So the important thing is, I think, for me, to begin to slow the mind down, to enter into a clear and clear relationship with one's mind, to begin to sever the automatic responses where you collapse into your stream of consciousness or your stream of emotions, so that you have sufficient distance on yourself that you can watch yourself being yourself. And if you watch yourself be yourself, and you watch all your habitual thoughts and your habitual emotional patterns arise, and if you can engage them without collapsing into them, if you can just witness them, we find that they change. The knots begin to untie themselves. The repetitions begin to soften. This is universal in any form of meditation and in yogic practice. And that type of training, I think, is also very good training for psychedelics, because you have to develop the same type of high engagement and yet a certain sense of detachment in order to allow your experiences to take you where you maybe don't want to go. Just take you there, and you just relax into it and flow with it. And that's what happens in meditation too. You relax and you go into the flow of it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's so important to have some sort of a practice to assist one with not only integrating psychedelic experiences, but keeping it alive in your daily life. And the people that I work with are often, come up against that. Well, how do I keep this alive? How do I keep this this new connection or this new opening that I've found and perhaps created at some level, or been a part of creating? How do I keep that alive in my daily life? Because they recognize the great depth and value and beauty of it, and they want to stay there as much as they can.
If there were one thing that I wish I could take from all the work that I did and reach into my heart and give it to people, it would be to lose their fear of death. Because the fear of death, we're always told, is the deepest fear that drives human behavior. It's the deepest fear behind all of our other smaller fears. And if you're afraid of death, you have your entire metaphysical worldview upside down. Death is graduation. Death is homecoming. Death is returning to the infinite source of our existence. Birth is when the hard work begins. Birth is the beginning of the hard time. But death is the culmination of everything that we've done. And we have so many bad ideas about what happens to us when we die. We're so inculcated by Hollywood and knowledge and, terror that's waiting for us, and hell. What a terrible idea, hell that's waiting for us. And none of those really stand up to the true test of really deepening experience. So, and I'll mention in this context that my partner of 25 years, my second wife, Christina Hardy, she died last spring. And she had cancer for 2.5 years. She chose not to do chemotherapy. She chose to die in hospice. She died quietly at home, surrounded by people who loved her. Christina was a psychedelic journeyer like I was. So she had no fear of death whatsoever, because she had already been where she was going when she died. She had already experienced the world that's waiting for her. She had enough experience of the love of the universe, the universal love of the universe, that she knew she was going to a fine place. She knew she was completely safe. And so she had that belief. I had that belief, both based on our experiences. And to see death as it truly is changes your entire experience of dying. Instead of it being a dirge of sadness or grief or, just the pain that separation always engenders, it becomes a celebration of a life well lived. It becomes the culmination of a life well invested. And so I really wish that if there were one thing that I could give to people, it would be, please give up your fear of death. Do your spiritual practice and read extensively. There's so much fine literature on near-death episode research and former life reincarnation research and spiritual research that really should just melt until there's nothing remaining of our fear of death. There's absolutely nothing to fear, because even if we've made some mistakes, mistakes we have to deal with the consequences of those mistakes, but none of our mistakes are infinite mistakes that have infinite consequences, and eternal damnation is just a ridiculous theological excess. There is absolutely nothing to fear in death. It's simply part of the cycle of our life.
Thank you, Chris. That's beautiful and profound and important, and I really appreciate you sharing that. Did you get any sense in your journeys of that? You called it the Bardo earlier, that in-between life state, and what are we like there? What is our consciousness like? What is our perspective like when we have truly left the physical body behind and gone into that perhaps in-between state?
Well, I have had a number of experiences of that territory, but I've also been informed by other researchers and writers in that territory. And of course, in addition to classic Buddhist text on the Bardo, the levels of the Bardo, two other people who have influenced my thinking in this regard. One is Robert Monroe in his books, Far Journeys and The Ultimate Journey. I think he does an excellent job of mapping some of the dynamics of the Bardo, the qualities of the Bardo, when he sees thousands and thousands of levels of the Bardo. Another person whose work I think highly of is Michael Newton, past life therapy. His work, basically exploring what happens to people when they die after taking hundreds and hundreds of people into the interlife state. He began to write a series of books describing the social structure of postmortem existence and some of the fundamental dynamics. His book, Journeys of the Soul and Destiny of Souls, beautiful works. But the basic idea here is when we die, we transition into spiritual reality, assuming all goes well, that we aren't stuck in physical reality or stuck near physical reality because of physical trauma or emotional trauma or addictions. We get sufficiently deep into spiritual reality. We make contact with other previously family members, loved ones, spiritual guides come and greet us, begin to take us. And then basically we go into spiritual reality as far as we're comfortable going, as far as our spiritual development allows us to enter into the infinity of existence, feeling comfortable. And eventually we get to a point where we feel like we're home. This is where we belong. This is our place. And there are other beings, lots of beings there. And there's a civilization of a spiritual civilization of cooperation, collaboration. If we incarnate again with a new agenda, and I believe we choose our incarnations, it's not random, it's a choice. And then we live our life, we become more than we were before. When we die the next time, we go deeper into spiritual reality, and where we stop is a more highly developed level of consciousness than where we had been before. And it continues to go on. And in Buddhism, they say there are what are called once returners, people who have one more incarnation before they have achieved their final escape trajectory. and then non-returners, beings who are not going to be returning, or they will not be returning by compulsion. They will have free choice after they transition at the end of this lifetime. Monroe talks about these types. He talks about the last timers. There is a reality outside the Bardo. There is a domain outside the Bardo. And I used to think of the Bardo as kind of an obstacle. It was standing between me and infinite experience. But now I'm beginning to understand that it's more like a security blanket. The Bardo protects us from the infinitely powerful radiance of divinity, our spiritual reality. That if we encounter this powerful radiance, the body of God or the mind of God, if we encounter it and we're not sufficiently mature spiritually, or we aren't ready for it, it just shatters us. It just can completely shatter us. It may shatter us into ecstasy, but we can't really take too much from it. We can't gather it in. We have to do a lot of spiritual work and go through a lot of purification and a realignment before our system is sufficiently strong and coherent that we can enter into deeper communion with divinity and stay consciously and stay whole within that divine embrace. And I think the Bardo is kind of like a security blanket that allows us to make this gradual process of entry into infinite consciousness, infinite bliss, step by step, staying within the margins of our developmental process.
You also mentioned this idea of sort of turning around the concept that I think we've all been taught to some extent of the up and out. Like the goal is to get out of, like, or maybe in many spiritual or religious circles, the idea that we're going to stop incarnating and get out of the physical world and move on. But
Yeah.
I think you also mentioned a perspective where actually the goal perhaps of existence is to bring these higher states of awareness into physical form. And I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but could you speak around that a little bit?
Essentially, all of the religions of the axial age, all the major world religions today, came into existence at a time in history where they tended to develop up and out cosmologies. That is, the idea was to achieve salvation, to achieve enlightenment, and eventually, when that happens, then when you die, you are free to not come back to the physical world. Who wants to be in the physical world when you can be in spiritual bliss? And that leads to all of the theologies of this period, or the philosophies of this period, postulated some kind of cosmic fall or some kind of fundamental diminishment of our human capacity, because when you experience spiritual reality, it feels like home. You know you belong there. And how could you be on earth when you know you belong in that spiritual world? So all the theologies that were developed were up and out cosmologies. So you achieve enlightenment, and once you achieve enlightenment, you achieve moksha, escape from samsara, escape from being reincarnated again and again. And that, I understand that tradition. I understand where it came from. I understand how it speaks to the human experience. But now we're living at a time when science is showing us the tremendous breadth of the universe. It's giving us an understanding of the age of the universe, of the developmental trajectories of evolution. It's showing us a much larger landscape. It makes less and less sense to say the purpose of existence, the purpose of spiritual reality, the purpose of existing is to abandon the physical universe, this 13.8 billion year project, just to get away from it and to go back home. But that leaves the question unanswered: why does the physical universe exist? Why did the infinite intelligence manifest this body of galaxies and galaxies and galaxies out of nothing from its own primordial essence? What is the role of the physical universe? And I think we're beginning to understand that experiencing transcendence and to experience the reality of our spiritual nature and that of the reality of the mother universe. The earth is the time-space is the daughter universe. The spiritual universe is the mother universe. But the goal of the project is not simply to escape the daughter universe and stay in the mother universe. The goal eventually, that transcendence is only halfway there. Transcendence is getting us halfway on the circle. The second half of the circle is to bring more and more and more of spiritual insight, spiritual power, spiritual truth into time and space so that we literally begin to create heaven on earth. We literally begin to create out of the fundamental, profound, bliss-generating truths of spiritual reality. We generate a life here in which we manifest that reality in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, and in our social relationships. So I think that the Epinaut cosmology is an understandable but a first approximation, an early approximation of what the project is. Now we are being challenged to even grow into a larger understanding of what our relationship is with the cosmic project.
So truly there is no escape. There is only transformation.
Yeah. And
would you agree?
I think there is. Basically, you can die and you can go away for a while, but you're going to come back. And you can die and you can come back and you can die and come back. Eventually you learn there really isn't a place to go. There really isn't an outside to the universe for you to get into because you're always going to be coming back. And the goal is to bring the depth of your being forward and the depth of spiritual reality internal to yourself so that you truly can live on earth, but with the true consciousness of heaven in your heart. And I think eventually what we're learning is that you can manifest the power of manifestation, and I don't mean this in some of the trivial early approximations of that teaching, but our goal is to manifest a truly enlightened, spiritually satisfying, harmonious existence inside time and space on an order and on a scale that's beyond anything that we have imagined yet. Because we've still been working within the umbrella of this older way of thinking. And the newer way of thinking, I think, is truly about living enlightenment, living spiritual realization, living salvation right here, right now. I don't mean as a set of beliefs and an emotional set. I mean right down to the physical, how our physical bodies heal themselves, restore themselves.
So you mentioned earlier being in the Bardo, and then perhaps that there might be a choice or some point where you have access to go beyond that into that state of ultimate power or enlight, or I don't know if that's where the diamond soul comes about, but would a being that is then moved into that, beyond the Bardo, still also be able to, or have the desire to come back into physical form? Maybe that's what Christ consciousness, when it manifested in Jesus, was. I know I'm going way out there here, but
I think the teaching is pretty consistent in that beings who have transcended the entire system, when they come back, they're not motivated by some of the smaller gains that motivate most of us when we incarnate, but they're motivated by compassion. They're motivated by the desire to end suffering in humanity and to help people find their way to identifying what the true cause of their suffering is and releasing themselves. No one can do this for another, but releasing themselves from their own patterns, which keep them small and shrunken and suffering in that smallness. So I think compassion is the motivation. This is the Bodhisattva's project, that it's basically to come back, not to help other people escape, but to help them escape their suffering and live an ecstatic life, a bliss-filled life here on earth, politically, socially, communally.
Oh boy, I feel like I'm going into meditation just listening to you talk, Chris. So I just want to ask you just a couple questions that I ask most of my guests, or in this case, since this is only episode 10 of Soul Unique, I've asked, I think, all of them. But What would you say to someone who is skeptical about all this so-called spiritual stuff?
This skepticism about spiritual reality represents where we are historically. We have good reasons to be skeptical. We have seen through some of the inadequacies of the theologies that have been with us for a couple of thousand years. We have seen the triumph of the Enlightenment traditions and by philosophical traditions of the age of the Enlightenment and the birth of science and all that stuff. And that naturally generates a kind of hyper caution or skepticism on spiritual truth claims. And to those, I would say, first, keep reading. Find good works by reputable people, reliable people that you can trust. Read the literature. Read the literature on past life therapy. Read the literature on reincarnation. Read the literature on near-death episodes. I mean, that's an extraordinarily powerful body of literature. I've had so many students have their life philosophy changed by reading these detailed empirical studies of people who have come very, very close to death and then come back. Read the literature on quantum physics and quantum mechanics, and listen to the scientists who themselves are saying that multiplicity of minds is an illusion. Ultimately, it all is grounded in one mind, one consciousness that underlies everything. Read the lives and the autobiographies of the great spiritual teachers. Look at what they went through in order to enter into the breakthroughs that brought them into the position that they're teaching from now. Read the psychedelic literature and understand what's going on there. And if you choose to participate in some of the meditation,
Read this one.
literature, well, there's so many fine books there.
Yeah.
And just read it. And if you decide to begin to experiment with some of these psychotechnologies, do so conscientiously, with great care, with great forethought, with being very cautious, with solid grounding, thorough debriefing. Work with somebody who knows the ropes, somebody who has experience in these domains. Because when you open up at this level using a system that can override your natural limitations, you can open up faster than is good for you. So it's important to pace yourself, to be opening up systematically and to be digesting thoroughly. But I understand the skepticism, but I've made my living actually as a professor introducing students to this literature. I used to teach a course called Transpersonal Studies, where we studied near-death episode literature, reincarnation literature, and psychedelic literature. And this was a life-changing experience, just to really work with authors who you really trust and to see where it goes and see if what their truths are, if they register in your heart as your truth.
So would you say there are any red flags that people should be aware of when exploring different spiritual paths, communities, teachings, or teachers?
Wow, there are lots of red flags. Oh my goodness, there's so many red flags. Our best spiritual teachers are humble. They have an acute sense of their own limitations. They're never aggrandizing, self-aggrandizing. There are all sorts of isms that you can get caught in, and teachers can get caught in. There are mistakes that teachers make as well as students make. There's just lots of reasons to go into any of these communities or into these spiritual relationships with eyes wide open, and with an open heart, though, at the same time, to listen deeply, to absorb deeply, to look whether a teacher's life is coherent with their teaching, if there is a dissonance between what they say and what they do. Look at the communities that are generated, because spiritual communities are intense. They're intense because people come into this work and it involves a lot of purification, a lot of cleansing. And when you have a community of people going through cleansing and purification, there's a lot of shadow in the room. It can be difficult. You have to navigate that carefully, conscientiously. With psychedelics, there are a lot of red flags. It's easier to do this work badly than it is to do it well. There's a lot of ways to get off balance, to kind of veer off to the side. It's challenging, and you can use psychedelics to bypass your own confronting your own shadow, your own spiritual shadow. It really, again, it takes a lot of conscientious work to use these powerful substances well, so that they serve you and that you don't end up serving them.
I'm curious if you might have a simple practice, technique, or approach that someone could try today to feel more spiritually aligned, or perhaps more just in touch with their inner being.
I don't think there's a shortcut on the spiritual path, and psychedelics themselves are not a shortcut. There is only the patient uncovering of the many layers of our own psyche, of our own being. But it all begins, I think, by getting sufficiently quiet and in tune with oneself to begin coming to terms with who you are, how you behave, what you're doing, and to begin to listen to the teachers of those who you respect, who know more or maybe who are a little bit further along in the spiritual path, and help you put aside the things that are not important, help you focus on the things that are important, to stop harming people with our actions and with our words, with our thoughts, to stop harming people. I think it was Gurud, one of the Eastern teachers, who said, we don't have the luxury of a single negative thought. Just stop harming. And when you stop harming, your whole system begins to calm down. And all the aggressive impulses that might lead you to hurt someone with your words, slowly they subside and your mind gets clearer. And then the second avenue that spiritual teachers talk about is now begin to do good. Now begin to be generous. Now begin to share. Now begin to just do some good in the world. That's different than not harming, but it deepens. As you do that, you begin to feel the ties that tie you to other beings. You begin to feel the connective tissue of life. And if you can combine that with an interior practice, with just turning within and letting your restless, bubbling mind, let it be, but just over and over again, engage it, follow it, guide it slowly, let it settle out into the quiet spaces until eventually you begin to experience the benefits of that quiet, the benefits of the clarity. Quiet isn't the ultimate goal. It's just a stepping stone towards the clarity that you begin to get glimpses of, the clarity that is your essential nature, that is your true nature. So I guess I would say find some quiet in your daily life. Find a time when you're willing to commit 15 minutes, half an hour, an hour. Work with your body, work with your mind, work with your lifestyle, with your ethics, and don't try to change too much too fast. If you try to change too much too fast, eventually you get overwhelmed and you just regress and you let it all go. But start with small changes, incremental stages, small changes. And if you can then stabilize those small changes, then you can take on another change. It's a little bit longer. Watch what you eat. Watch where your food comes from. How much suffering is in your food. Watch your conversations. Watch your social discourse. It's just a matter of watching, being attentive, and then trying to be consistent so that you become gentler, you become clearer, you become kinder, and you're underway. You're on your way.
Thank you, Chris. That is just beautiful. That could be a template for daily living. Absolutely. And of course, I see all of that in you so beautifully. You're such a beautiful, humble, wise soul, and I appreciate the connection so much. So my last question is a simple one, maybe a fun one. Do you have one, maybe two or three all-time favorite spiritually oriented book, or just, personal transformation book?
books have always nourished me so deeply. There have been so many of them. Of course, Stan Grof's books have always been very nourishing to me. He's covered a lot of territory in his books. The writings of Sri Aurobindo speak to me very deeply. I mean, it's extraordinary that he wrote all of his books in 6 years, sometimes he channeled his books, and he was working on several books at the same time. Very, very deep, very transformative. The tantric teachings that come out of an historical tradition where people have been cultivating enlightenment and post-enlightenment developments of their conscious capacity for generations. I mean, it's not a matter of having practiced for a few decades. They practice for a lifetime and come back and practice another lifetime and come back and practice another lifetime. And out of these lineages of deep spiritual cultivation, there are classic texts that emerge. And I think those texts have been very helpful to me on the path. And I'll send a couple of names your way.
Okay, wonderful. Oh my gosh, Chris. Well, I think it's time to wrap this up. Thank you so very much. It has been, again, such an honor. Having you as a guest here has been a dream come true. Truly an honor. And I want to send you off with my deep gratitude for joining me today and for sharing your profound, insightful, beautiful, and important work with the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Anu. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for bringing these conversations forward, and I really appreciate your work.
I am so grateful to Chris Bache for joining me today. This episode has turned out longer than my usual goal for around an hour, but Chris's answers to my questions are so eloquent and insightful, and even beautiful and moving that I had to include them all, and I hope you enjoy and appreciate them as much as I do. For more information about Chris and his books, you can visit chrisbache.com. That's CHRISBACHE.com. As always, it's my intention to make the resources and information that were mentioned in each episode of Soul Unique as easy as possible for you to track down. I'll be posting as many as possible of the resources on the soulunique.com website, so you can check them out if you'd like. And if you'd like to join me on this journey, I encourage you to sign up for the Soul Unique mailing list at soulunique.com, and I'll keep you up to date on new episodes, inspiration for your unfolding path, and other resources. Lastly, I'd just like to add a quick plug here that if you appreciated and resonated with this episode, I will be forever grateful and honored if you would please like, follow, and maybe even write a short comment about the episode on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. It will help tremendously in spreading the good vibes about forging a personal spiritual path, as well as about this continually evolving podcast. Thank you for your consideration, and thank you very much for listening today. I hope you'll continue to tune in to the Soul Unique podcast in the future, and I'm wishing you well and sending you highest vibes as you continue to navigate your life, and yes, perhaps even your own personal spiritual path. Thank you for being here.